I want to talk about the role of the media in driving this new Cold War that we find ourselves in, and specifically US corporate media, but also the role of the US government in driving the narrative of the US media. And, it was really ironic this week to see as the Chinese consulate was forcibly closed by the US government in Houston without any apparent provocation, any incident at least to provoke it. Senator Marco Rubio, who heads the de facto anti-China commission within Congress, the Executive Commission on China, declare his justification for closing the consulate, which was that it was a base of spying. This is always the seeming justification these days. And I found it ironic considering not only the dearth of evidence for this claim, but what had recently been revealed about the protests in Hong Kong since the passage of the national security law. It's been revealed that the US Agency for Global Media, which oversees Radio Free Asia and the Voice of America, the main US government broadcasting agencies abroad, had contributed $2 million to the protests, including supplying logistics and secure communications equipment through its open source initiative to protesters. And as we know, these were not exactly peaceful protests. In many cases, they made what's happening in Portland look like a Shriners parade. $2 million from the US media organization to destabilize Chinese territory. Can we imagine the US response if Xinhua or CGTN was supplying communications equipment and money, direct money, rapid payouts, as the US did to protesters, so-called Antifa protesters in Portland? It would be the biggest escalation we've seen of US-China relations in decades, probably since the Korean War, and the way the US would react. But this is exactly what the US did in Hong Kong. We've recently seen protest leaders of these supposedly organic grassroots protests like Nathan Lau and Joshua Wong hanging out with Mike Pompeo as they go into exile and begin to lead growing anti-China lobby from London to Washington. And what we did at the GrayZone as soon as these protests broke out was to expose these relationships between the US government and the protest leaders. This is consistent with our work throughout the years to really probe the micro socio-political relationship between the US and opposition groups in countries where the US seeks regime change. And someone who's been really helpful in this effort with regard to the new Cold War on China is Ajit Singh, who's helped organize this discussion. Ajit has done so many important reports for us at the GrayZone on the institutions inside the US driving this new Cold War and forming the corporate media narrative of hostility. For me, I really started reporting on this at a meeting in Congress on Capitol Hill, where a who's who of congressional leaders from both parties were present at a National Endowment for Democracy ceremony honoring North Korean dissidents, many of the people who were quoted about Korea in US media. And it was there that I met someone named Omer Kanat, who is the head of the World Uyghur Congress, in this hall inside the US Capitol. Media was all around this character, and I wanted to know who he was, and I wanted to speak to him. And I realized that he was the head of a multi-million-dollar dissident lobbying group, the World Uyghur Congress, a very right-wing anti-communist organization funded entirely by the US government, very similar to the Cuban American National Foundation or the groups that Juan Guaido and his white-collar mafia are trying to form in Washington, that are dedicated simply to regime change and providing quotes to US media. I immediately got into a conversation with Omer Kanat about a narrative that was forming at that time in 2018 about millions of Uyghurs in so-called concentration camps in the Xinjiang region of Western China. And I asked him where the sources came from for these staggering numbers. And he told me that indeed the World Uyghur Congress, funded by the US government, was supplying many of these testimonies and so-called sources to US media. But I asked, who are your sources? Where do they come from? And Omar Kanat said, well, our sources are Western media and some testimonies we get. So he basically was describing a feedback loop where it was impossible to get to the bottom of these numbers, which are reported as fact, to portray China as a new Nazi Germany in mainstream US media, and now on the floor of Congress, where sanctions bills have been passed on the basis of these so-called concentration camps. Probing deeper, with the help of Ajit Singh, we found two sources, absolutely only two sources for these claims of millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps. The first was someone named Adrian Zentz, someone who thinks a lot like Mike Pompeo and has about as much expertise in the Chinese language and Chinese politics and society as Mike Pompeo, the stooge of the Koch brothers from Kansas, does. Adrian Zentz laid out his worldview in a 2010 book called Worthy to Escape: Why All Believers Will Not Be Raptured Before the Tribulation. Indeed, Adrian Zentz is an evangelical right-wing fanatic who has declared that he is on a mission from God to topple the Chinese Communist Party, which he views as a satanic communist entity. And in his book, he has argued for scriptural spanking or corporal punishment. He has called diversity and homosexuality a satanic plot, and yet Zentz is called upon as a key expert in US media on issues ranging from repression of Uyghurs in Xinjiang to supposed forced labor of Uyghurs in Xinjiang. And we've shown that his methodology is shoddy. It all boils down to a few testimonies from a handful of characters in partisan Uyghur media. The other source is Chinese human rights defenders, which again is funded by the US government, is a dissident organization based in Washington, and which actually is based in the same office as Human Rights Watch, and which relied in its study on testimonies from a grand total of 8 Uyghurs from Xinjiang, and which extrapolated the population of the villages that those 8 people inhabited into the total of anywhere between 250,000 and 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. So the point here is that when you look at these numbers and you go to the source, there's no there. We need to have more evidence. And when you look at how these sources are quoted, whether it's figures from the World Uyghur Congress or Adrian Zentz, Chinese human rights defenders, there is no background in US media or context on what they actually believe, or the fact that the United States government has incubated these organizations and is funding them. It's the same for the stories we constantly hear about forced labor in Xinjiang. The sources boil down to primarily the Australian Strategy and Policy Institute, which is funded by the US State Department, the British Foreign Office, and the arms industry, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, which is funded by the same exact elements: the arms industry, the US State Department, and other foreign governments. CSIS.
I'm sorry, Max.
Yeah.
Max. Could you just wind up very quickly now, because you're out of time. Sorry to interrupt. It's very important.
Yeah. So, in closing, I just wanted to get some of these details out there. It's really dismaying for us at the GrayZone. We're a left-wing site, to see other left-wing media organizations like Jacobin, Democracy Now!, The Nation relay these US government astroturf claims. They are absolutely unquestioned in respectable liberal left media. And to question them actually crosses an invisible red line where you put your career as a journalist in the US today at risk in the name of trivialities like the truth and global cooperation. As Vijay Prashad previously mentioned, we are witnessing a hybrid war. And one of the key aspects of hybrid war is information warfare. Information warfare fundamentally corrupts journalism. It transforms correspondents and reporters into frontline soldiers in this hostile Cold War. And so while policies may shift, if executive power transfers to the Democrats in November and January, this hostile narrative and astroturfing will continue. So it's our job to provide the context and to provide an alternative to this hostile media narrative.